Hey, IC Healers. My name is Mandy, and I'm the founder of IC Healer. Now, I have a special treat today. I'm here with the founder of VitalSide, Lindsay Mitchell. And she's an expert in neuroplasticity. Now, some of you may be asking what this is and how this relates to IC. And to be honest with you, I was asking the same thing until I learned about the brain in my functional neurology course in my doctorate. And I was very fascinated, and it soon became one of my favorite courses, even though initially I was very apprehensive about learning about the brain. Now, the brain is really amazing, and it has the ability to rewire itself, and this is known as neuroplasticity. Scientists used to think that after childhood, our brain was locked in place. But now, with better imaging technology, we can see how the brain changes, and specifically in how we use it. So how does this relate to IC? Well, as you know, I've been studying IC and the bladder and bladder pain for about 3 years now, and I've seen a very common theme with all patients with IC BPS. And these include disorders such as autonomic dysfunction, limbic system disorders, neurogenic inflammation, complex regional pain syndrome, and even IBS, fibromyalgia, and central pain syndrome. They all originate from dysfunction in parts of the brain and central nervous system. So what I love about what Lindsay does is she is living proof from her own experience with a chronic illness that you do have the ability to change your genetic expression, your ability to detox, and so much more. You really can be consciously responsible for your own healing, as she says herself. And this is really, I believe, the missing piece for those of you who feel that you've done all the protocols, the gut, the detox, inflammation, you're doing the diet, and you're just not getting the results that you need. I think neuroplasticity is so important that I'm going to be adding quite a bit of content right from the start in group coaching so that participants start getting results right away and start noticing faster resolution of their symptoms. So without any more delay, I would like to introduce you to Lindsay Mitchell.
Hi, Mandy. Thank you so much for having me today.
We're so glad to have you. So before we talk about neuroplasticity, I'd like to learn more about you and tell us your story. How did you start VitalSide?
Sure. Yeah, so like you mentioned, I do have a history of chronic illness. And that's when I really got interested in neuroplasticity is from my story. So I grew up, I experienced some trauma as a kid, was faced with an abusive caregiver, mentally and physically. And so I was kind of not really a well child. I was diagnosed with Epstein-Barr virus in my teens. And just kind of had this chronic inflammation, and it all kind of stemmed around the time that I experienced that abusive situation. And, I was a happy person, though. I continued to study and do well in school, and I went to a lot of therapy to address some of this trauma, but my body was still responding in this hyperinflammation. And so I ended up studying biology in school, went to physician assistant school and started working as a PA in internal medicine. And then throughout that time, I was exposed to different, environmental toxins, bacteria, things like that. I was around a lot of rural environments in South America. I traveled to Africa. And I was exposed to a lot of these different toxins. So what ended up happening is there was sort of this buildup of toxins in my body. And I ended up getting bitten by a tick in the redwoods and was diagnosed with Lyme disease a few months after that. And so that tick bite kind of became this perfect storm. And to me, looking back, I understand, well, a lot of it had to do with the childhood trauma, putting my body into this stress response, this fight or flight from a young age, and then continuing to be in this inflammatory state, as a teen growing up and being exposed to a lot of those different toxins. And so I, after that tick bite, that became my perfect storm, put me out Was bedridden with Lyme disease and co-infections, with, chronic pain, fatigue, daily migraines, the works, right? All of these kind of symptoms that we're so used to experiencing, the brain fog. And that really put my whole life on hold. It put my career on hold, basically everything. And I was homebound. And during that time, my background is Western medicine. So I started there. I tried all of these different medications and treatments and protocols. And luckily, I actually had a grant for Lyme disease, which was really amazing, from the Limelight Foundation. So I was able to try all of these different treatments. And a lot of them worked to an extent. And, I'd get a little bit better, but then I would plateau, and I kind of stayed there. I wasn't seeing these huge improvements. And to me, I was thinking about it, and I was like, I'm typically a healthy person, right? There's no tissue disorder. There's nothing wrong with my body. Why am I not seeing the progress that I really should be at this point? Why am I in this constant state of inflammation? And, going to doctor after doctor and hearing, you're just going to have to live with this. It really put this kind of feeling of dread and hopelessness, on my heart, thinking, like, really? Am I really going to have to live with this forever? But luckily, I was able to hold on to this glimmer of hope, because I had a support system around me. My husband was saying, no, you're not going to have to live this way. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm not. I am healthy and I am strong. There is something else. So I continued to do research. I continued to find out alternatives, and I tried everything. And I came across this idea of how the brain actually changes when we're in a state of chronic stress. And so the chronic stress can be from an illness, from a bacteria, from a virus or a toxin, or it could be stress from something that happened emotionally, or a mental stress. And so we have these physical, mental, and emotional stressors, and the body memorizes these stressors and begins to react in hyperinflammation. And so that when we deal with a chronic illness or a chronic trauma of some sort, it's not necessarily that, our body isn't strong enough, or, we're not detoxing well enough. It could be that our brains are in this state of chronic stress. And when we're in that state of chronic stress, it makes it really, really difficult to heal. Oh, yeah. Because, we're releasing these stress hormones, and like cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine, and it takes away attention from your immune system, your ability to detox, your gut, all of these really important organ systems and processes in our bodies that help us to detox and help us to feel better. So, when I read that just on a blog post, I was like, yes, 100%, this makes so much sense. And there's a couple programs that are offered out there. I did them all. I really focused my attention on making these changes to the stress response in my brain in this organized way, because, to be honest, I did not want to ingest another pill. I did not want to, put something else in my body. And I had learned about these internal healing properties. So it made so much sense to me. And after, committing a lot of time, every single day, making these changes, doing these mental exercises, becoming aware of my thoughts, all of this, these different protocols, this different processes. I spent about 8 months, doing that. But at that 8-month mark, I no longer had chronic pain. I no longer had food sensitivities. I was no longer operating from a chronic state of stress, of that fight or flight response. And, I went on a trip with my husband to Costa Rica, and I had a piece of pizza with real cheese and I surfed on the beach. And the most important thing for me was that I didn't have this hyper-inflammatory response to those things.
Right.
And so that was, a huge indicator for healing. And I just became so interested in all of this. And I knew how important, these healing properties of the brain were, and how this isn't discussed a lot of times in your regular practitioner's offices. And this is the missing component to a lot of, that gap between, I think I can get better and, but I have these diagnoses and I'm not seeing any improvements. And so I became really interested in this, studied it, became certified in neuro-linguistic programming and some other techniques that helped me to develop the protocol for VitalSide. So now, now from a place of being healed myself and having gone through that experience and my medical background, what I do is help to educate people on the healing properties of the brain and teach people a protocol they can use to calm that stress response so that they can decrease that inflammation, decrease that chronic stress, and really see a difference in their symptoms and really begin to heal.
I love that. And, you said so much that I totally resonate with. I love the fact that you have your own story. It jives with me because I do believe that we walk the talk and, we are our own success stories. And through that, the passion, I can just see the passion when you're talking about this. And that's what I feel it the same way. Like I get chills whenever I think about, things related to healing and I see other people's successes. And even when you're talking, I was getting chills because it's so much different to hear it from somebody who actually has lived it as opposed to, oftentimes a doctor will tell you to do something, but they don't really understand your pain, so that's amazing. And I love, what you were just saying about food intolerances, because that is a sigh of relief for a lot of us with IC and bladder pain syndrome, because, we're so hyper responsive to certain foods and it becomes like we're a fear. And it's almost like, if you were to give us a placebo and tell us it was our food that we're not supposed to eat, we'd still react to it. And that makes a lot of sense now from everything that you were just saying, because there is that strong neurological component to it. And if you can calm that down, yes, you're hearing me, girls. I mean, you can eat the foods that you've been missing. I mean, it's possible. We're not saying go and eat a big cake, but, you don't have to be afraid of a little bit of exposure. And I think that's where a lot of people are. They're so afraid to eat anything. And this is food and this is what we need to live, to thrive. So thank you for that. So now that we're on the topic of neuroplasticity, and it sounds like a very technical word, the word plastic kind of scares people off. Can you, in layman's term, explain neuroplasticity?
Yeah, sure. So neuroplasticity, it is just a fancy word. Neuro is, the brain, the nervous system, and plasticity means malleability, the ability to change. So ultimately the brain's ability to change. And this isn't something that, somebody discovered. This is something that's been happening, for all of human existence. Our brains are changing all of the time. And so, yes, within the last couple of decades, now we have the science to prove it. So now we have, functional MRIs and electroencephalograms and these machines that actually measure how our brains change. But this is something that's been going on forever. And so when we think about this concept that the brain changes, we think about, the things that we do, the things that we watch on TV, the conversations we have, the things that we tell ourselves, the things that other people tell us. All of these, life events have an impact on our brains. And, you know, you can kind of notice this in real time if you've ever been around maybe a situation of high stress or people who are unsupportive and they're kind of anxious, you know, and they talk in that way, and they're, you know, experiencing that sort of panic, anxiety, and all of a sudden you start to feel it, right? And so it's our brain picking up, you know, we have these mirror neurons, and neurons are basic brain cells. And what our neurons are doing are they're seeing this other, you know, person and how they're reacting. And the brain is saying, you know, I know that feeling. That's anxiety. That's panic. And so those neurons are communicating with your body to experience that stress, even if it's not a personal situation going on, even if it's just mimicking what they're experiencing and what they're feeling. And so, you know, that's just a quick example. I think everybody has experienced that, but it's a quick example of how, you know, neuroplasticity is something that's going on all of the time. And when we have a chronic illness, you know, whether it's IC, fibromyalgia, these chronic diagnoses, it's like our brains are in this constant state of stress because we are either fighting off, you know, a toxin, we've experienced trauma, you know, like what I talked about, the physical, mental, or emotional trauma, and our bodies memorize this trauma in the same way. And so it's like we're experiencing that again and again. And so at this point with these chronic conditions, it's like neuroplasticity has now been, it's kind of a disadvantage at this point because our brains are reliving this trauma, telling our bodies to relive this trauma again and again. And so the really cool thing about this, though, is that the brain is always changing.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not permanent. It's just the brain is picking up this information from the environment, from what you're telling it, from all of these past experiences, and saying, hey, body, react in this way, in this inflammation. But the good thing about neuroplasticity is that we can change it. So we can actually make positive, beneficial changes to our brains to see a result of decrease in inflammation, of, you know, feeling good, feeling happy, feeling excited, feeling maybe those goosebumps like you're feeling earlier. And that's all experienced by changing what neurochemicals we use. So we talked about in that stress response, we release cortisol and adrenaline. Well, when we feel good, and we change those neurochemicals to make us feel, you know, gratitude or safety or something like that, we release, you know, serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, these feel-good neurochemicals. And when we do that, we break this cycle of stress because we can't be releasing these feel-good neurochemicals at the same time we're releasing cortisol and adrenaline and these other neurochemicals that keep us feeling stressed. And so that's how we make changes to our brains. And so, you know, perhaps in that situation where you're surrounded by those people who are maybe anxious and, you know, panicky and all of that stuff, you can even remove yourself and you can go watch your favorite, you know, funny clip of your favorite comedian and laugh for 2 minutes and feel better. And that's because you're making a change to your state, you're making a change to your brain. And instead of, you know, your mirror neuron saying, oh, release stress, release anxiety, release panic, now you're able to release dopamine because you've laughed and you've sent that signal to your brain that you can relax, that you can be calm and you can be at ease because the things around you are safe. And that's how we make positive changes to our brains. And that's just one, you know, simple example of how we can do that.
Yeah. So you mentioned positive and negative neuroplasticity. So you basically, it's a continuum. You can go in one way or you can go the other way, but you have the ability to go in either direction. And so I'm wondering, because I'm thinking about exercise now, and you know, when we exercise and the more we do it, that we have that muscle memory and we're better and more efficient at doing it. Is it the same thing with neuroplasticity? the more you do the positive reinforcements to create that positive neuroplasticity, it's easier. So, initially maybe we have to practice more, but then as we do it more, it just becomes natural and normal for us.
Yes, exactly. And I love how you bring up exercise, because exercise is this other example. It's another example of doing something physically that makes a change to our brains, because when we move our bodies and we exercise, we release endorphins. And when we release endorphins, we start to feel good. And then, after doing exercise for a couple of weeks, I feel good. I'm in this routine and I feel stronger. I'm growing these muscles, but at the same time, I'm releasing these endorphins that keep me wanting to go back. And it's the same thing with these brain training exercises. Yes, at first it's weird. It's something different. It's breaking this habit, right? We have these patterns of stress, of chronic illness, of chronic inflammation. And so when we start to break that cycle of stress, it feels a little bit weird at first, but then we get used to experiencing that release of endorphins, of these feel-good neurochemicals. And when we do that, we want to go back. We want to keep going back. We want to keep staying motivated to practice and to get those endorphins released. And so it does require some momentum at first, and some incentivizing in these types of things just to kind of form that habit. But once we do, and once we express those endorphins, man, it's hard not to go back, because we have memorized this neurochemical response to exercise, or to this mental exercise that we're doing, and it keeps us wanting to go back.
I love it. I do love that. Wow. So you already mentioned childhood trauma. So my next question for you is, can you clarify the limbic system? I think sometimes we get confused into like the autonomic, dysfunction and the limbic system. Can you just clarify those terms and what they are and how they relate to all this?
Sure. So the limbic brain is the emotional, the feeling, and reacting brain. And basically it's part of the brain that consists of different structures that have to do with, releasing neurochemicals, experiencing emotions, feeling, and reacting. All mammals have this part of the brain. Actually, killer whales have the biggest limbic brains, and that's why they're often like emotional and reactive creatures. So this is the part of the brain that houses the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is this structure inside of the limbic system that communicates with the pituitary gland. And so it's kind of this hormonal control center of the brain. And, you guys probably know the pituitary gland is responsible for releasing hormones. So the limbic brain is constantly in communication with the pituitary gland to release specific hormones. And if you're in a state of danger, if you're in a state of, the situation is bad, this fight or flight that we talk about, the hypothalamus is sending a message to the pituitary gland to release stress hormones, which communicates to the rest of the body to release those stress hormones and increase physiological functions like your heart beating fast, your respiration rate, increasing, blood flow to your hands and your feet to run away. And so, this whole response is known as the sympathetic response, which is also this ANS, the autonomic nervous system. And so this response is triggered by the limbic system, by the hypothalamus in particular. So they go hand in hand. So they're not, these separate entities. It is all about the nervous system and that sympathetic response. And as humans, our go-to response is the parasympathetic response. That's naturally the state that we operate in. And that's also part of the autonomic nervous system. So the parasympathetic response is known as growth and repair, whereas the sympathetic is that fight or flight response. And so these are responses that we have been using as humans from the time where we had to, fight off danger, big tigers, saber-toothed tigers, or, whatever it is, and protect ourselves. And so it's a really great natural response. And then parasympathetic is generally our rest and digest, our growth and repair. That's when, we're getting a lot of blood flow to our gut. We're feeling relaxed. We're feeling at ease. But just through the evolution of humans, what's happening is our go-to response is no longer parasympathetic because we have stressors in our lives, watching traumatic situations on the news, having our cell phones ring, having all of these situations that, increased exposure to environmental toxins, all of these things that can cause us to get into that sympathetic, that fight or flight response. That has now become our go-to response. And when we're in that state, again, it makes it very hard to detox, to decrease inflammation, to put focus on the gut, the immune system, these types of things, because we're solely focused on survival. How the heck do we get out of this situation, this dangerous situation? So when we're in the parasympathetic mode, we can relax, we can detox better. Our immune systems can function well. And that's what I do in Vital Side, is I teach people how to naturally get back into that response. But again, parasympathetic, sympathetic, all part of that autonomic nervous system, which is controlled in the hypothalamus, which is part of that limbic system.
Well, that's so interesting, because a lot of people with IC and BPS are also low in thyroid hormones. They're low in sex hormones, and they have adrenal dysfunction. And a lot of times we'll find that there is low cortisol across the board. Now, some will have high, but majority are low, because I think they're already in that stage 3 of adrenal dysfunction, which is when the cortisol is actually lower. And then I also find that their secretory IgA, which is your immune system of your gut and also your mouth and also your vaginal area and bladder, we all have this immunoglobulin, is low also. And so I almost am wondering, and it sounds to me that because of the limbic system and that chronic fight or flight that we're in because of society and modern life and trauma and everything that you mentioned, and then also our immune system is suppressed, which is almost like this vicious cycle where you've got, chronic stress, a lot of negative emotions, then you create this fight or flight, you've got the low cortisol, low SIGA, low immunity, autonomic dysfunction, chronic infection, high inflammation loop. Does that sound correct?
Yeah. And so what I refer to that as the negative feedback loop, because you're getting information from your body, information that's inflammation, from your body, right? And then you're also getting it from your environment, the things around you. But it's this vicious cycle, like you mentioned, of this negative feedback loop of your brain is continuing to say, we're in danger. We need to do something right now, and there's this fluctuation of the different hormones, the different neurotransmitters, and it's this vicious cycle of that inflammation. So the body is putting out signals and the brain is responding to it. At the same time, the brain is putting out signals and the body is responding to it. So it is, this chronic stress, this chronic negative feedback loop. And that's why we have to break it. That's why we have to do something drastic to break that negative feedback loop, or else you get worse. And you guys listening have probably noticed, when I focus on my inflammation, when I focus on the pain gets worse. It moves, it changes, and this is something where we have to address this, and we have to break this cycle of this negative feedback loop.
Yeah, I hear that a lot when somebody says, when I'm laughing. I had one girl say, I made her laugh, and she says, you made me laugh, and now my pain's going away. And there it is. I mean, and then I do hear a lot of times the pain's moving. Like it's not just localized in one spot, because that would be an injury, correct? Like you'd be injured. But the fact that it's moving usually signals that there's something else going on. So with that, what kind of tools can you offer people to calm the stress response? You said break the cycle, and also reboot the nervous system. And you can also describe what kind of things that you've been doing with your clients, with Vital Side.
Yeah. And first, I want to quickly mention, some of the things to look for when you think of, autonomic nervous system dysregulation, limbic system impairment. You hear these words. If you don't exactly know what that means, that's okay. But things to look for: pain that comes and goes, spreads quickly. When you think about it, it gets worse, right? It's not localized to one part of the body and stays there. Brain fog that fluctuates, fatigue that comes and goes, memory impairment. So sometimes you can drive somewhere and you don't remember how you got there. And, headaches that wax and wane, they come and go. And so just a few kind of symptoms to keep in mind. And again, chronic inflammation, whether that is experiencing this pelvic pain, whether it's experiencing chronic headaches, all of these types of things, they're really good to look for and to say, oh, perhaps I do have, limbic system impairment or that autonomic nervous system dysregulation.
Wow.
Something just to kind of keep in mind if you're like, I don't know if this is for me.
Yeah, I didn't know about the headaches. The headaches, can you explain the headaches?
Sure. And, headaches is just one of those symptoms. We think about headaches that come and go and they kind of change location. Maybe one day they're temporal, maybe one day they're occipital. And it all comes back to inflammation. So headaches, food sensitivities, brain fog, fatigue, pain, it all comes back to that inflammation. And I can't necessarily tell you why one person experiences headaches and why the other person experiences bloating. But, it's our body's way of telling us that we have inflammation. And so if you have a headache and, it comes and goes, it changes, like I talked about, it is that result of this persistent inflammation that's manifesting itself as a headache. And so something that's interesting about pain in general, but also headaches, is that when we're in this chronic state of stress, basically these cytokines, which are, protein signaling cells that increase inflammation, are being released and exacerbated. And it causes that inflammation, but it's not necessarily a response of an acute tissue injury, right? And so we can differentiate that from bumping our heads, getting that headache, and then having it go away, versus a headache that kind of comes and goes and changes. But that release of cytokines is our body's way of telling us, hey, something is wrong. This inflammation is occurring and we're experiencing this pain. So what we're going to do is, send more help to the area, increase that inflammation, and then you start to kind of notice that pain may be increasing. And it can be a result of the stress response. So it's not always, like I mentioned, sometimes we have the acute issues, but when it's chronic and persistent and it changes and it comes and goes, that's a good indicator that it is a result of that stress response.
Gotcha. So what are some of the things that you do to help people break that vicious cycle?
Yeah. So like I kind of mentioned earlier, going into that growth and repair, that parasympathetic response is so important. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. So in Vital Side, I use mental exercises, mental rehearsal. We use visualization techniques to change what neurochemicals we used. So to experience those feel-good neurochemicals, like dopamine and oxytocin to break that cycle of stress. And we also use things like laughter, changing, how our bodies express different symptoms as well to break that cycle of stress. So a few things that, you can use today on your own. Deep breathing is a huge go-to. And so something important to keep in mind is that, we can only control our reaction, and we control our reactions to situations, to life events, to everything, but we're only responsible for controlling how we react. And so what I recommend to a lot of people is to deep breathe before they make a decision, before they answer a phone call, even doing it a couple times a day. And some of the things that you're doing when you're deep breathing, and when I say deep breathing, I mean feeling, your gut move up and down when you inhale and exhale. So actually feeling that movement. And one of the things that you're doing, when you deep breathe, is you're stimulating the vagus nerve. And so that nerve that runs from your brain to your gut that connects to a bunch of different organs in between. But when you stimulate that vagus nerve, basically it's sending a message to the brain that you're okay, that you're relaxed, that you are safe. And that's huge when we have these daily stressors in our lives. So, I encourage you, if you're listening, you can take a deep breath right now, but do it a few times a day before you make any major decision. And really feel that change, and do it a couple of times. And something else that's going on, when we breathe like that, is we're syncing up our breathing to our heart rate. And when we do that, we're also sending a message to the brain that we're okay, that we can relax, that we're at ease. So it's all of that. The goal is always to get into that parasympathetic, that growth and repair, rest and digest state. And so that's something quick that you can do. Something also that you can do today is gratitude. And we hear gratitude, talked about all of the time, and there's different journals and things, and everyone's like, yay, gratitude. And there should be a lot of recognition around gratitude. And one of the reasons why it's so important is that when we're expressing gratitude, we talked about breaking away from that stress cycle. Well, when we're expressing gratitude, we're releasing those feel-good neurochemicals. We no longer release these hormones, these stress hormones, and these stress neurochemicals. And we're focused on the good in our lives. And so it's doing a few things. We're memorizing a new response to what's going on right now. So we see the symptom that we're experiencing, we see it for what it is, but guess what? There are other things going on that I can be grateful for right now. And when you do that, gratitude is like a superpower. You're breaking away from this cycle of stress, and you're putting attention on the things that you are appreciative for in your life right now. And when we have that influx of that emotional response, and we bring that feeling of gratitude, that elevated emotion, we're memorizing a whole new experience. And guess what? Those symptoms of pain, fatigue, brain fog, we're giving those less power. We're diminishing those. And so that's why your client who said, yeah, you made me laugh and I feel better, she's breaking away from that cycle of stress and putting focus on those feel-good neurochemicals. And the more often you do it, just like exercise, the better it feels, the easier it gets to feel, and eventually that becomes your state of being. Eventually that becomes your normal, your new normal. And how cool is that we've had control over that, making changes to your physiology, right? Your neurochemistry, and memorizing a whole new response. So gratitude is a great way to do it. And the cool thing, about what we do in Vital Side is we use components of these techniques in this organized protocol to make changes to your specific symptoms, whether it's pain, fatigue, whatever it is. And we talk about how to train with them, how to elevate your emotions, how to change your neurochemicals through a specific protocol. And eventually the goal is to get yourself into that parasympathetic so that you're not experiencing these daily symptoms.
Yeah, I like how you also brought back the exercise again, because with exercise, I know with me, I'm a fitness instructor and I've been exercising, for years now. I need it. It's like I crave it. And so it sounds to me that it's kind of the same thing as once you created this new story for yourself and you memorize these new lines and this new way of looking at stuff, you're going to crave it. And so you're going to seek it more. And it's going to be almost like a subconscious way of doing things. It changes how you actually behave to things because you're craving these neurochemicals, and it's almost just like exercise. I don't even think twice about it. I don't have to plan it into my day. Exercise is part of my life. It's like brushing my teeth. I know I have to exercise at a certain time and it happens. I don't even have to debate. Is it the same thing?
Yeah. And so at that point, at this point, exercise has gone from maybe initially becoming a habit for you to now this memorized subconscious thing that you do every day without even thinking about it, right? You're like on autopilot to go exercise.
Yeah.
And yes. And so eventually what happens is the brain starts to memorize this parasympathetic response. That becomes the new normal. And eventually that's how you're responding all of the time. So people who do vital sign, do it for a certain amount of time. I ask for a minimum of 6 months, but eventually they get to the point where parasympathetic, that's their normal go-to response. And then they don't have to do the same techniques every day, but they can do other things that are really beneficial, like mindful meditation and these types of things. I personally see that mindful meditation is something that's really difficult to do when you're in a chronic state of stress, because when you bring awareness to the present moment, all of a sudden everything comes raining down on you and you're paying attention to your pain and your fatigue and all of these things, and it kind of exacerbates that cycle. So that's something to look forward to. That's something that's definitely beneficial in the future, but it doesn't always work for the person who is in a chronic state of stress today. So VitalSight is specifically designed for that person dealing with chronic symptoms, but eventually getting you to the place where you're living your life, you're feeling good, you're relaxed, you're healing, and you no longer even have to think about going into that parasympathetic mode, but you have modalities like meditation and exercise and, spending time by yourself, doing self-care things, going out in nature, all of these things that also help you to stay in that parasympathetic mode.
Very nice. I like that. So, so a couple more questions. What is your experience with people with IC? I think you had mentioned you had a few clients that have IC. What has been your experience?
Yeah. So, again, just like the headache example, it all comes back to inflammation. And, it's really stressful when we're starting out and we're like, I've been diagnosed with IC, I've done this medication, I've done these different treatments, and nothing seems to be really working. And so, yes, there are different ways you can decrease that inflammation, through diet and through exercise and through, these other modalities that you talk about, which is really helpful. And then there's this brain component. So it all goes back to calming the stress response. And so when we're in that parasympathetic mode, it decreases our inflammation. We're in rest and digest, and we can really focus on that. And we're no longer, in that state of urgency, of panic, of anxiety. So it makes it more likely for our bodies to heal. So it's the same with IC. And so when we start to decrease that inflammation, we start to think about our pain in a different way. We start to think about that urgency in a different way. We can actually, just like a muscle that we train through exercise, we can train our bodies to decrease that overall inflammation and start to feel good again. Now, it looks a little bit, so the protocols I teach are the same for each person. But for someone who has IC, it'll be a little bit different from someone who comes in who's got OCD, right? It's just about how you use the protocols. So for that person who has IC, we're going to start to train around, pelvic pain. Maybe that's where we start. Maybe that's a place we start. And what we do is we do this process of incremental training where we will focus on the pain for just a couple of seconds and then go through this protocol that changes our association to that pain, changes our state, breaks that chronic stress cycle so that eventually we get out of that chronic stress cycle and we no longer experience that, hyperinflammation. And so that plan is going to look a little bit different, but I've seen, people with great results who, have IC, can decrease that inflammation and, while maintaining a healthy lifestyle and calming that stress response, really start to see huge changes to the disease process and really start to, live life normally again and get back into that place where they're doing things and they're no longer even thinking about the IC and they're operating, from that growth and repair state.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really encouraging, actually. And it's, I do believe it has been the missing link for a lot of people. You say anxiety because anxiety is probably the number one symptom I see across the board with people with IC is anxiety. That butterfly feeling, that feeling of just being anxious, even like when there's no, and I remember for myself, I had walked myself into the emergency room a few times back when I was really sick, just feeling like I was having a heart attack. And I walk in and of course they put all the equipment on me and they're like, you're totally fine. But it felt so real. It felt like I was going to have, I must have been a panic attack and it came out of nowhere. There was no trigger, it wasn't like I was in a situation of an argument with anybody. It wasn't like I was, it just kind of just happened, and so I see that now, like everything you're saying is really starting to make sense now. And it's like it's almost like I got that last puzzle piece and I just put that puzzle piece back and now I see the whole picture. So that's really, really insightful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, it's really important to point out that even though the machine is telling you that nothing is wrong, it is not all in your head. It is not. It's the brain and body's communication. And the brain is communicating danger to the rest of the body and it causing you to experience that symptom or exacerbate that panic attack response. And it's just this miscommunication that's going on in the brain and the body, this chronic cycle of stress. And so it's so important to point that out because, I myself included have thought, oh my God, I'm going crazy. And you're not. And it's the way that the body's experiencing stress. And it's not all in your head. It's very, very real. And it is that autonomic nervous system dysregulation. And that's why we can now put a label on it, which feels so good. Because, before it sounded like it was all in our heads. And it's absolutely not.
Yeah. Well, wow, this is great. I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you. And as we put our group coaching modules together, we're going to have some content in there for everyone because I do believe that this is how you should start your healing program is start with calming down the nervous system because it'll allow everything else you do to really stick and really work. So this is really exciting and I'm so happy to have met you. I'm honored to have this meeting with you and looking forward to, working more with you and seeing what other things you've got in store for everybody. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm going to end the meeting here now. So thank you for attending. Thank you for being here with us. And if you have any questions or you would like to reach out to Lindsay, I'm going to put her website link at the bottom of the YouTube page. She'll have where you can go visit her website and she'll have a booking link and you can have a consultation with her. I highly recommend that if you feel like anything that we've talked about resonates with you and you feel like you are definitely in this vicious cycle of, neural inflammation and you have this autonomic dysfunction and you don't know how to get out of it, I highly recommend you place a call with her and see how she can help you, because I really believe this for a lot of us is definitely that missing link. So thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.